Thanks to incredible Daily Article podcast listeners like you, we are thrilled to let you know that the $150,000 matching grant has been met. Now, as we approach the end of 2024, we're setting our sights on reaching the remainder of our $2.6 million year-end goal by December 31st. Doing so allows us to step boldly into 2025, helping our growing audience of listeners discern news differently every weekday. Your generosity will help create resources that nurture listeners like you to become the salt and light that Jesus called us to be. With every dollar you give, you'll help expand Denison Forum's reach through the Daily Article podcast and many other resources. So please visit supportdf.org by December 31st to help meet the goal. Again, that's support, the letter D, and the letter F.org. Together, let's partner to ensure that more people can face each day's news by speaking God's truth in love. Give your gift today at supportdf.org. Find the link to give in the episode notes. It's New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 2024. Welcome to the Daily Article Podcast. I'm Chris Elkins with the Denison Forum, narrating today's Daily Article written by our co-founder, CEO, and good friend, Dr. Jim Denison. As a year filled with conflicts draws to a close, our hearts yearn for lasting peace in the new year. To this end, let's look at the unlikeliest of places for the hope we need. In the Middle East, 2024 began with Hamas's leadership seemingly entrenched as the conflict in Gaza continued. Hezbollah bristled with tens of thousands of missiles capable of devastating all of Israel. Iran was escalating its seven-front assault on the Jewish state through its proxies surrounding the Jewish state. So much changed across the year. Israel assassinated the top leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah, neutered the latter's missile threat against the nation, defeated two air attacks from Iran, and dismantled Iran's air defenses in response. Iran's hardline president was killed in a helicopter crash and replaced by a more moderate leader. Rebels toppled the Assad regime in Syria, further weakening Iran's Shiite crescent across the region. There was a time when many, including former President Jimmy Carter, believed Hamas to be a legitimate political player in the quest for peace in the Middle East. Mr. Carter also called Israel an apartheid state and spoke for many in opposing its posture with the Palestinians. At the same time, as his former speechwriter James Fallows noted following his death last Sunday, Jimmy Carter did more than anyone else before or since to bring peace to the Middle East with his Camp David Accords, end quote. Mr. Fallows may be correct in political terms, but Scripture tells of another leader who resolved a conflict in the Middle East in a way that points to lasting peace in 2025 and beyond. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 begins in verse 1. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. Judah's king Hezekiah responded in three ways. First, he did what he could. Jerusalem's greatest military weakness was its water supply, which came from the Gihon spring outside the city. The Assyrians could block, divert, or even poison it, which would force the Jews to surrender. So, the king created a massive tunnel to bring water from the spring into the pool of Siloam inside the city. Then he camouflaged the source so the Assyrians could not use or pollute it, as we read in 2 Chronicles 32, verses 2 through 4 and verse 30. This tunnel was 1,750 feet long, the length of 6 football fields. It was completed in 701 BC, but still functions today. I've walked through it several times over the years. In addition, the king strengthened the fortifications of the city and, as we learn in verse 5, made weapons and shields in abundance. Second, Hezekiah encouraged his people to trust God. His message to them in verses 7 and 8, "Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." Third, Hezekiah himself turned to God. When the Assyrians threatened the city, recorded in verses 9 through 19, and then in verse 20, Hezekiah the king and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, prayed because of this and cried to heaven. The word prayed translates a typical Hebrew word for interceding, and the word cried adds a deeply personal note, meaning to call out in agony. Here was the astounding result recorded in the first part of verse 21. The Lord sent an angel who cut off all the mighty warriors and commanders and officers in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned with shame of face to his own land. Then in the latter part of that verse, he then came into the house of his God. Some of his own sons struck him down with the sword. In this way, as we read in verse 22, the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, king of Israel, and from the hand of all his enemies, and he provided for them on every side. I cannot know what conflicts you're facing in the days ahead, but I know this: Hezekiah's story is in Scripture, so it can become our story. Because God assures us in Malachi 3, verse 6, that I, the Lord, do not change, we can know that He possesses the same power, knowledge, and compassion that led to a miraculous peace in the Middle East 27 centuries ago. If we are not seeing His hand similarly at work in our world today, could it be that we're not looking closely enough? Perhaps, for example, we should view events involving Israel over the last year through the lens of providence. Theologians differ over whether the modern state of Israel should be seen as equivalent to the Israel of Scripture, but we know that God still judges the kinds of atrocities perpetrated by Hamas, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and the terrorism-sponsoring state of Iran. His word assures us in Malachi 4, verse 3, He shall judge between many peoples and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. All He has ever done, He can still do today. And we know that what is true of others is true of America as well. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people, stated in Proverbs 14, verse 34. The prophet said to God in Isaiah 60, verse 12, The nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid waste. Accordingly, we read in Psalm 32, verse 12, Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. So name your Sennacherib, do what you can in response, and encourage those who are in the battle with you to trust God for His best. Then turn to Him yourself, asking Him to do what only He can, and pray urgently for our nation to do the same. The best way to prepare for the new year is to make Jesus our King, submitting our lives fully to His Spirit, as instructed in Ephesians 5, verse 18, as we live biblically and act redemptively in our world in accordance with Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. It is then to treat every new year and every new day as if it is our last, knowing that one day we'll be right. Jimmy Carter famously stated, We should live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon. Will you? The Denison Forum team is grateful for our daily article podcast subscribers. Please share the podcast with others. And for more news discerned differently, visit denisonforum.org.